This is Book Chat with Tod Goldberg. We're super excited to see him again. He's a lot of things, best-selling author of all kinds of things, different genres. We'll be talking most today perhaps about his crime fiction. He's also co-hosts a couple podcasts and directs the world's hottest MFA, literally, unless there's one like in the Sahara or something.
I don't think so, not yet.
Yeah, that we don't know about. And he has a dog named Rube Goldberg.
That's an important thing.
Is that right? Yeah. So what I thought I'd ask you, Tod, you probably read literally hundreds, if not thousands of bios in the course of picking students for the program and deciding who's in and who's out, and also probably in literary criticism and all kinds of things. What's the biggest mistake people make in a bio, and what do you always wish someone would say about you and they never do?
You know, I have only really two things in bios, particularly those at the back of book jackets, that make me crazy. The first is the photo of the dumpy middle-aged author like myself wearing a leather jacket, standing in an alley, looking hard. You know, like the author's gonna defeat crime by his steely gaze. Like, dude, you have a degree in English. Just take a picture like a normal human being. So there's that. And then I'm always fascinated by the bios that say, you know, so-and-so has a degree from NYU in creative writing. He also is formerly a longshoreman, a rodeo clown, and spent 5 years in the Merchant Marines. Like, oh, give me a fucking break. Oh, am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, totally.
Like, if I were to have a bio like that, it'd be like Tod Goldberg, who was the president of his fraternity and the homecoming king of Cal State Northridge, spent 3 years writing infomercials for a living. And that's what gave him his steely-eyed gaze. Like, come on, man. Just say where you live and who you're married to.
In other words, keep it short.
Yeah. Short.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you've done as much as I have, obviously.
Yeah. I know. It was hard. It was really hard to condense. And, you know, so I say to people, just go to Tod's website because it's all there.
True.
With those pictures of him in a black leather jacket, leaning against the wall, smoking, and
now that being said, I do remember my first author photo. I was living in Las Vegas at the time. It was for my first book, which is somewhere back there. And when I took the photo, I was 28 or 29, and I'm wearing a black turtleneck, inexplicably. And I'm sitting in an alley in Las Vegas on some stairs.
Wow.
Staring out into the middle distance, you know, like I'm a teen idol, which I thought I was because I was 29. When you're 29, you're always ready to be a teen idol, if at all possible. I've tried to avoid that, but I can't avoid the steely-eyed glare. I mean, it's just my face.
Right, it just is. Yeah,
and
those hollowed-out cheeks and
right. Yeah, my heroin chic.
It just is. You know, could it be that we're all inspired by album covers?
We totally are.
Yeah,
absolutely.
all those photos of skinny, drugged-out guys and and thinking that's cool.
Yeah, that has never been me, sadly.
No, me neither. Never will be. Yeah. So kind of on a related note, we're really appreciative you're here because I know this must be a crazy time. One of the impacts of the pandemic and the quarantine for you running an MFA program is that I don't really know how many years it's been, 10, 12?
12 years.
And now you're planning a virtual residency.
I am. I was literally doing it up until about 5 minutes ago. Yeah, you know, it's everything is different, of course, and I think people are giving a lot of latitude for the things that they used to do compared to the things that they're going to do right now. And that's an important part of everyday life, but it's also an important part of what we're doing for school. But the overwhelming thing is that the guests that I've invited, they all want to do it. They're all excited to do it. They're all excited to be paid to do it. A lot of us are spending our days on Zoom for free. So they're happy to be paid to do it. But the fact is it's not the same.
Yeah.
And you can't replicate sitting across from someone and having coffee or a drink or whatever and talking about your life and about your writing and all that stuff that we normally would do at a residency. You just can't do that on Zoom. And so, I'm a little depressed that we don't get to have the normal residency that we typically would have, but I'm excited that the students are still going to get the opportunities they normally would. But I'm also a magical thinker, and I'm seeing, that, well, look, if we're in a bad position in December, we'll do everything outside at this hotel that we normally do our residencies. All these things are possible. But the idea that in a couple weeks, I'm going to gather up 100 students and 15 faculty and a bunch of guests, and we're going to spend our afternoons talking about writing, that fills me with excitement and joy. And that I get to do it from my home, which means I can get up and go and use my own bathroom. I find that extraordinarily enticing. But everything's different. Everything will be different, but the quality of the education doesn't change. The quality of the instruction doesn't change. It's just the delivery method that does. And we all have to get used to that.
Yeah, and you don't have to walk out into the Palm Springs heat to get to your room.
Oh, that's true. That is absolutely true. And it will prevent, I'm sure, some personal issues that people typically have at residency that they regret after they come to residency for walking to other people's rooms at night.
Yeah, all that stuff. Yeah, I won't talk about my residency.
I don't want to know, Dorothy. Don't tell me.
Yeah. Well, one of the features of residency that I recall, not with fondness when I had to do it, but it was really fascinating when others did, was, are you still going to do, like, in the private setting, I'd call it an all hands meeting, but like when you start the residency, you bring everyone together. Yep. So all the new students, and you have typically, I don't know if you still do this, ask each new student a question.
I do. Yeah. We're still going to do that live on Zoom.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, what's been the most revealing question you've ever asked that's like maybe embarrassed you, or you wish you hadn't asked it, or you're really glad you did?
Gosh. Well, there was a person who looked a little peaked once, and I asked that person, when was the last time you got sick? And they were like, about 20 minutes ago.
Yeah.
I did ask a mild-mannered person, or a person I presumed to be mild-mannered, when the last time was they got into a fist fight.
Whoa.
And it turned out that this was a person who liked to fight. And so that colored my my interactions with that person from there on out. But, typically when I ask the new students a dumb question, it's more often to reveal something that other people can talk to them about later to help them make them feel a little bit more comfortable, because everyone has something weird. There was one time I asked a student if they had a secret skill, Michelle Castillo, and she said, I can sing opera. And she got up and she sang opera in the middle of orientation. I was like, wow, this woman is going to make me cry with her voice. Yeah. And then I asked someone if they knew what Cool Whip was made of once. And when they didn't, I told them that by the end of residency, they both had to tell me the history of Cool Whip and provide me with a cake. And they baked a Cool Whip cake, and it was delicious. Absolutely delicious.
Even knowing what's in it.
Yeah, so divine power does have its perks.
Very good. Very good. Well, before moving into like real book stuff, maybe I'll ask Sue and Shelley, did you want to jump in?
I'll ask a quick question.
Sure.
I was just thinking about, I just finished teaching my semester of, regular composition classes. And I was wondering, for someone like you who not just teaches creative writing, but runs this program, if you have a sense after all these years of if there are categories of things that can be taught to a fiction writer, things that can only be learned through experience, and things that a person is born with as a writer.
Yeah, well, the key thing is you can't teach talent. So if someone doesn't have talent, it's sort of a moot point. Now, the position that I'm in allows me to not have to worry about that, because I'm selecting the students, and therefore I'm selecting people that have talent. But previously when I taught, undergraduates or at UCLA Extension, places like that, or at a writers conference or something, you can tell right away when someone has a point of view made for creative work, that they see the world in a different way and they want to explore it in some unique fashion. So you can teach someone to write with more descriptive language. You can teach them, how to write effective dialogue. You can give them exercises for those things. You can teach them all of those things. Whether or not they can apply them is an entirely different thing. I of course believe that a lot of us are born with certain talents. I can't play a musical instrument. I don't even I love music and I don't even understand how it's made. When I'll watch a guitarist and it's like, what are those fingers even doing? When I air guitar, I just stand quietly. I don't even move. And but there's some arts where I think, well, I could probably do that. I was like, I remember I acted when I was in high school, and I thought, oh, that might be something I could probably do. Probably not well, but I could probably do it in community theater or something. I'd make a hell of a Prospero. But if you don't have a point of view, if you can't imagine someone else's logic, then you're never going to be a successful writer, because our job is to put ourselves into other people's bodies and imagine the way that they think, people that don't have any thought like us at all. And so a lot of what I do with beginning writers frequently is say, look, don't write about yourself. Don't write about a person who's anything like you. Write about the opposite of you, right? Go outside and see the person, walking in the street in front of you and imagine what their life is like. And that ends up being an exercise for me too, to see well, is this person capable of imagining what someone else's life might be like outside their own peculiar biases? So yeah, a lot of it can be taught. The craft can be taught. But without the talent, you're just destined for a sad and lonely life in the arts.
On that cheery note, I'll mute myself.
I was going to say, or maybe amazing success.
Right. You're just a sociopath if you can't imagine other people's logic. That's what that means.
Yeah. Sue, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was struck by what you said about part of what the difference between teaching writing and being a writer involved being able to put yourself in somebody else's body. Mm-hmm. And use the skill, crafty parts of things that you can learn in an MFA program, but you have to combine it with that. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't work.
Right.
So my question for you is, how did you do that when you wrote for yourself in your own writing? When you wrote your crime novels, Gangster Nation and Gangsterland, which are the ones I've read, or actually I'm trying to read Gangster Nation, but my guy I live with has absolutely co-opted it, and I cannot get it out of his hands. And I have to say, you have a huge new fan, and he would have asked you, had a question for you today, but he forgot. So
wonderful.
My question is, after that long thing, is how is it? What was your process of putting yourself in that other body when you wrote, say, Gangster Nation and Gangsterland?
Well, the character of Rabbi David Cohen, Sal Cupertine, the hitman who hides out as a rabbi, when I started, so I first wrote that character in 2009 in a short story called Mitzvah, which was in my book, Other Resort Cities.
Right, I read that.
And after I wrote that short story, I was like, there's more to this. I clearly have something to say about this character. The problem was, I'm Jewish, but I'm a terrible Jew. I'm a bacon and mayonnaise Jew, and so I didn't know the Torah and the Talmud and the Midrash and all this, theology to the level that I'd need to know it in order to write a rabbi. Because in order for this character to pretend to be a rabbi for so long, he in effect needs to become a rabbi. And that's the key for any con that you're going to write about. When I was writing Burn Notice, which is that book there, I got that was my training in essence. I wrote 5 of those Burn Notice books, and the key for Michael Weston in Burn Notice is that he takes on the personality and the lives of other people to do his cons to get people out of bad jams. And so in a lot of ways, writing those books helped me to write about this rabbi. So I had to read all the books. I had to understand what my character would know at a given time in his education as a rabbi, so that when he quotes the Talmud or misquotes the Talmud or the Torah or whatever, that's in line with where he is in his learning. But in fact, the desire to write this character and to explore Judaism and explore, sort of loss. There's a lot of stuff that happens in this little crime novel. At base, it's just a simple crime novel, but there's a lot of emotional stuff that goes into this main character, which I think has helped it resonate with readers beyond the sort of normal life of a crime novel, which is probably why we're talking about it. In order to explore those things, part of it was that I was exploring these things in my own mind. I started to write Gangsterland in 2012. My mother had just died. My father had died. And all of a sudden I found myself standing on top of my family tree versus being one of the branches, and not really knowing how I'd gotten to this place in my life, not really knowing the struggles of my grandparents and my great-grandparents to get us here, to give me this life that I have. And so, dealing with what is normally called, I think, probably a midlife crisis, right? So all of that was happening at one time while I was trying to write this book. And so a lot of that stuff sort of filters into what Rabbi David Cohen and then also his nemesis, Jeff Hopper, are feeling about their lives. I was going through some of these things in my head and realizing these are things that I could write about. But to embody those characters, I'd like to kill a lot of people on a fairly regular basis. I've got a list, and I update it at 6 each night when Rachel Maddow begins talking. I was like, okay, let me add another name, Rachel. Thank you. Let me add another name, Rachel. Thank you. So, my murderous thoughts and my desire for revenge and to mitigate chaos is rich. But I also have this sort of theory of crime fiction, which is that if people are going to die in a book, if there's going to be violence done in a book, that it can't be cartoon violence. It can't just be something explodes and 20 people die and there's no ramifications for it. And so I wanted, when I was writing the character of Rabbi David Cohen through those first 2 books, and a book I have coming out in February, and then the novel that will come out after that, and the TV show that hopefully Amazon will make, has always been about understanding the ramifications and the consequences of action. And that when somebody dies, it's a pebble into water, and the ripples are eventually going to reach shore. So that someone might die in the first book of Gangsterland, and the payment due for that death might not show up until the last book. And so all of that is also sort of part of my my feelings about crime in general. There has to be law, and there has to be order, and there has to be equanimity in those things. And so, these are all things that I thought about while writing this book, but I still had to try to make it entertaining. And so in order to make it entertaining, I also had to spice it with a little bit of humor. And the humor that the Rabbi David Cohen has, there was no invention there. It is the same exact humor as your friend Tod Goldberg has. It is the same exact humor. It is me. I am the jokes. And so there wasn't much invention needed for that. It's like if I were tough, these are the things that I would say in these situations.
Can you actually shoot a gun?
I can.
You can? Did you learn how to do it to write this?
So I've gone several times, I think 3 times, I've gone to a very cool thing called the Writers Police Academy. And they hold it at law enforcement training centers at different places in the United States.
No kidding. Wow.
And they get law enforcement, FBI, DEA, NSA sometimes. They get ex-gang members to show up and do stuff. And it's a 4-day course in all the things you need to know. So you get to shoot guns, you get to drive cars, you get to talk to people that have been deep cover, you get to interview FBI agents, you get to take classes on blood spatter. You get to charge through a burning house with a SWAT team. I mean, it is really cool. I think, unfortunately, I have to cancel it this year. But I went out there and I was so there's a bunch of classes you can take on shooting. And I was like, look, I need to shoot with a Glock and I need to shoot with an AR. Like, these are the guns that people use in my books. And they're like, yeah, no problem. And the first time I shot, I was quite scared. And then by the time I was sort of done the first year that I trained, I felt pretty good about it. When I went back the next year, I was basically an assassin. Basically an assassin.
That's hilarious.
So that's fascinating. That's fascinating.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's fascinating to know there's actually a place where English majors can learn to learn what they need to know to write crime novels.
Yeah, and it's even there's a great class that they do that, in fact, I'm replicating at my upcoming residency called How Cops Walk and How Cops Talk, because I get so annoyed reading my students' work when they don't understand how a cop walks and how a cop talks. Right. And so I'm bringing one of the Writers Police Academy people out to actually teach that class online to the students. I will say, though, that the last time I did it, there's this car chase thing that they let you do where you get to do the pit maneuver where you spin a guy out in front of you, what cops do when they're in an actual car chase. And so you're in a police cruiser and you're chasing a car and you're on a controlled track, out in the middle of Wisconsin somewhere. And they're like, all right, you got to keep it to like 25 miles per hour. I was like, yeah, that's no problem. That's no problem. And so I'm doing it and I cannot stay under 50 miles an hour. And the cop is like, Todd, here's the situation. If you die, no one gets to do this anymore. And so I was spinning cars out and screaming, all right, motherfucker, get out of your car. And they're like, okay, all right.
Crazy.
I love it.
So this is the book.
Yes, I wrote that. I remember that one.
You remember this one?
Yeah.
Kind of building on what you were responding to Sue. So you started with the story Mitzvah, and you created the character Sal Cupertine, who's a hitman. Right. And then we move into Gangsterland and we have, the rabbi is sort of born at the end of the story, right? I remember.
So Mitzvah, the short story, is actually his last day on the job as a rabbi. So it's his last day, but it shows a little bit of his genesis.
Right.
But I didn't stick to the facts in that story. So that story took place in the present day. He had been on the job for 15 years, all this stuff. And so, when I started to write the book, I was just like, well, I can't stick to those things. And this has been a problem for me over the years because in my new book, The Low Desert, which comes out in February, there's stories that I've written that I've then written other stories with the same characters over the years. And The Low Desert, I'm now connecting them to this larger world that I've created in Gangsterland, and then in a secondary world that I've created based on the short story in my book, Other Resort Cities, called The Salt, about a sheriff at the Salton Sea in the 1960s. That's going to be my next thing. But as I was doing The Low Desert, I realized that I got all sorts of details wrong in some of these older stories. And so I was like, oh God. And so my poor editor, Dan Smetanka, he was like, you need to chart out these actual people's lives. You can't just wing it, Todd. And I was like, well, I wrote some of this stuff in 1998. I don't remember what I was thinking. And so I'm going to have to put a disclaimer in the front of The Low Desert. If you've ever read any of this stuff before, none of that applies.
Forget about it. It's like when they edit the movies for inconsistency.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but what this is showing me is, since I read the story and I've read the two novels, and they've all kind of mushed in my head, even though it was written with backstory, so we learn about Sal in different ways, my mind resorted it so that I learned about Sal first, and then he went to Vegas. So It's interesting how once you create a world, you can't know how your reader's going to internalize it.
Yeah. And I mean, the other side too is that, the books are pretty long. They're 400 pages each. Yeah. And to get those 400 pages, I probably wrote 600 pages for both of those books. And I'm not always 100% sure what has happened.
Well, that's why you have an editor, right?
Right. But like I'll be working on something and I'll be like, wait a minute, how many kids does that character have? And I'll be like, I should have a document somewhere that has this information. Then I'll get onto Amazon and I'll type into the search in the book like kids, Ronnie, and I'll be like, oh, 4, he's got 4 kids. All right. We're gonna have to kill them all.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're not one of those authors that has these spreadsheets and stuff and vision boards and everything with all this stuff on it. But really what intrigued me, what I wanted to ask about is, so the character, whether it's Sal or David, because they're the same person, is your protagonist, is the person that runs through all the stories that we care about. And that's a funny word to use, but he is very empathetic. And maybe the key to part of that is that the humor is Tod Goldberg. But even with Sal, I mean, he's killed a bunch of people and he's done some awful things, but he loves his wife and kid and he's loyal and he doesn't want people to suffer. So is it wrong that I like him? And was that your intention? I mean, I root for him not to get caught. Is that wrong?
No, I mean, that was the intention all along, was to subvert what typically happens in a crime novel. In a normal crime novel, the main character is the FBI agent, right. Jeff Hopper. And I've set up Jeff Hopper as the adversary. He's not the villain, but he's the adversary. No, the reason that Sal Cupertine is empathetic for all the reasons you gave, but the other chief reason, he's empathetic because someone else loves him. Yes. And if someone else loves him, then you begin to ask yourself, well, what is in this person that makes that person who we've met, his wife, Jennifer, love him? Why do we trust that her love is accurate, that he is worthy of love? Because you can write a nihilistic character and have it be great. Like, Dirty Harry, people forget that, part of why Dirty Harry is that his wife got killed in the first Dirty Harry movie. But the reason that we love John Wick and we're willing to follow John Wick around while he stabs people in the eye with a pencil or shoves a book down their throat or blows up, every city that he's in, is that he loved his wife and someone killed his fucking dog. And you're like, that's enough for me to have a murderous rage for the rest of my life too. If, like, my wife's dead and you killed my dog, it's on. It is fucking on. Yeah. But that empathy is hard won. Because it's a concern of mine always going through this, like, what's the point of no return, where a reader would be like, nope, I can't follow him anymore. And there's a point in the second book, in Gangster Nation, where he kills a woman. And if you haven't read the book, I won't reveal who the woman is. And he kills her in such a heretical way to the Jewish faith that it's... I mean, it's every single part of this particular killing that he does is vile. And I was like, oh God, I don't know if I do this, like, this might be the turning point. And I remember I went out into my living room, which is right over there. And I had written the scene and I was like, God, maybe I'll change this person from a woman into a man and I won't have to worry about it because people will accept men killing men. And I was talking to my wife and I was like, I feel really nervous about this. And she's like, this is his turning point. Like, him doing this thing is his point of no return, right? And I was like, yeah, that's the point of it. Like, once he does this, he's altered for the rest of his life. And, he's going to feel like he carries that death around his neck like a yoke. She's like, well, then you got to do what you got to do. And then when I turned the book into my editor, there's actually 2 things that happen in the book that are sort of gasp-worthy as it relates to the morals of the world. And my editor, Dan, was like, oh shit, you went for it, didn't you? I was like, well, he's like, it's great. I gasped. It was great. It was great. But you will still feel empathy for someone who does something terrible if they begin to feel bad about the things that they have done. I mean, and writing a bad guy is hard because I could just have him go around doing badass shit all the time, but I want him to have a code of some kind. And that's why these books have been successful. I think that's why there might be a show. That's why I'm able to wring, a couple thousand pages out of this one guy's life.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right.
Dorothy, can I interrupt to ask a question?
Of course.
I was just wondering, Tod, since you talked about how the killing of a woman would be morally or aesthetically different than the killing of a man, I was very curious what you think about characters who themselves are women. And in particular, I'm thinking about the TV show, which is kind of my happy addiction, Killing Eve.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why do I love Villanelle so well? And does she violate something about this? Like, once the woman is the killer, do all the rules change?
Well, there's a lot in that. There's probably a senior thesis in that. Just historically, women have not been serial killers, and women have not been assassins, and women have not gone to prison for killing other people. You hear about a woman who's a serial killer or who kills someone because it's novel. You don't hear about men who kill someone because it happens 1,500 times a day, and on TV shows in particular. So invariably, it's surprising when there's a badass female character who kills people. So when you think about like the trend for this, it was shocking when La Femme Nikita came out in the early 1990s. Now, of course, La Femme Nikita was a little kid, I'm transposing two things: The Professional and La Femme Nikita, which are very similar movies. But The Professional, she's a little kid and she becomes an assassin. La Femme Nikita, she's a badass assassin, and she's had this crazy life. But it was like, that was nuts that La Femme Nikita was this person. And so it changes what we think about, I think, culturally and morally about the role of women not being the crazy, fucked up people who go shoot up schools. Has there ever been a female school shooter? I don't know.
Song, I Don't Like Mondays. Wasn't that based on a shooting at University of Texas?
Maybe. Oh, the Boomtown Rats song. Yeah. Right. So there's a lot to be said for that. And I don't have the full answers, but what I can say is that we are in a boon area of women crime writers. Laura Lippman, Megan Abbott, Ivy Pacoda, Steph Cha. You're seeing some of the best crime writing on the planet, and it's coming from women. There was this sort of movement in the late 1990s, and the women themselves branded themselves as tart noir. Writers like Vicki Hendricks, where it was just as dark and just as violent and just as sexual as any of the male stuff, but invariably the women they weren't killing other women; they were killing men. It was it was an actual sea change in the genre. But I think, as it relates to the mob, what I write about, the mob doesn't kill women. That's their thing. Like, that's the one part of their code that by and large they have adhered to. It's the difference between the mafia and, say, street gangs. Street gangs will kill anybody. The mafia has a matriarchal point of view in murder. Like, don't kill women. And so when he, in my books, does that, it's also a flip on everything that's happened in the history of mafia fiction that I'm trying to show. Like, of course this is going to happen because women are now federal agents. Like, eventually these things are going to happen. So I'm both poking fun and shining a light on the sort of hypocrisy, because of course any dead person is a bad dead person,
Thanks, Tod. Maybe one last question, and then we'll see if people out there want to ask some stuff.
Sure.
I wanted to kind of explore the topic of crime fiction, movies, TV. Obviously, a lot of us are watching a lot of Netflix lately and other streaming kind of things. And there are so many shows and series that revolve around death, particularly murder,
right?
And different brands of murder, right? You've got the whole genre of serial killer shows, like you've got the mafia shows, you've got detective shows, you've got legal shows that focus on, the aspect of the lawyer, forensics, all these little deviations. And obviously we're fascinated with death because it's something that happens to us all and we try to pretend it's not gonna. But what is it about murder, do you think, as a writer, that captures it's like our horror and our imagination, right? We don't want to look, but we look and we can't stop.
Well, I mean, it's the ultimate human deception. It's the thing that breaks the code of humanity. Like it's the one thing you can't do. Someone will look the other way if you rob someone. Entire states will look the other way if you rape someone. But if you rob someone, if you kill someone, that's it. Then there is going to be action eventually, unless you're, shooting an unarmed person as they run from you. Eventually there will be action. And so people are fascinated by the destruction of the human code. Like that's a big thing. The thing that pushes a person to do the ultimate worst thing. But there's also this thing that I've been fascinated with for a while, and then I just had a conversation with this philosopher about it. This issue of terror management, and it's this philosophical theory that says that our entire lives are ruled by not thinking about our death. And everything that we do, everything we set up in our lives, from our belief in God or our following of baseball teams to our watching of Chopped on the Food Network, is to avoid thinking about how we might die. And so when you get then a TV show or a book or anything about how someone has both been killed and the person who makes that choice, like that is an affront to your terror management. Everything that you think you're doing to prevent the worst case scenario can be undone by a man with a gun. And like that's a fascinating and possibly agoraphobia inducing reason for us to watch these things. Like, my God, the world could kill me at any given time. I'm not leaving my house. More salient lately than perhaps in times before. But the strange thing is, I think a lot of people find these murder shows cathartic because if they're on TV, particularly, and if they're in books too, the murder gets solved. And the joy of reading crime fiction is that you are dropped into chaos, and eventually someone solves the chaos. Eventually someone sets things right. And it might just be a little thing. It might be a big thing, depending upon the kind of book or movie or TV show you're watching. But it's satisfying to have a conclusion where a person is caught for the thing that they did and then they are punished. And it's also edifying sometimes to know that a person did something, they got away with it, but other people know about it. Like, when OJ went to prison for robbing that guy in Las Vegas, and they put him away for 10 years. He didn't go to prison for 10 years for robbing that guy. He went to prison for 10 years because he killed his wife. And he had committed a crime, but the Nevada legal system gave him a sentence far exceeding the crime that he had committed. And it was like public mourning had finally set in, like, finally this guy is getting his. He's going to do 10 years in prison. And so that was sort of a cathartic experience. Like, finally, this guy is getting his, at least a little bit. Yeah. And so that's why Law and Order has been on the air for 25 years. That's why Gunsmoke was on the air for 30 years. People like to see a situation resolved and for the good to win eventually.
Yeah, certainly. But gosh, if you look at the listings, you would think that murder happens like every 2 seconds. I mean, right? And maybe there's some analogy, I don't know what it is, to the pandemic of how we're reacting to that relates to our general fascination with death. I don't know.
I mean, our fascination with death is hardwired into us because, like you said at the top, it's the one thing we're all going to do. And none of us want to end up, in a ditch somewhere. And that's like the great fear is dying like that. So, thrill is found in your fear. That's why people go to Six Flags instead of Disneyland. The imagination doesn't always provide the same thrill as fear does. And I think that's what these shows do, and that's what these books do. But also, I'd like to believe that crime fiction and crime TV and movies, they do a pretty good job in the best case scenarios of showing you a segment of society that you might not normally see. There was that wonderful show on Netflix about the woman who had been raped. The young woman had been raped, and no one believed her, and it turned out she had been part of a serial rape.
Yeah.
And it's a true story, and the adaptation of it, I can't remember. I want to say it's like Unbreakable or Unknowable or something like that.
I did too.
It was so good, but it revealed, like, right, you can receive injustice because you were living in a group home and someone came and raped you in the middle of the night. You're not believable because of the station in your life. And of course, we already know that from, the disproportionate number of African-American men in American prisons. So to look at society and examine those things, I think is valuable. It's something like that a show like The Wire did really, really well, where every season they would look at a different part of American society and examine the crime within it. So they would look at the media, they'd look at the schools, they'd look at drug dealing, they'd look at the actual inside work of the police department, they'd look at the docks in Baltimore. All of these things have a Ponzi scheme inside of them somewhere, I regret to inform you. But that's what crime writing and crime fiction does that perhaps literary fiction does not. It's, it's more interested in the world on the other side of the belly button than the inside of the belly button.
Yeah, and it taps into those basic fears and things that are going to trigger the page turning.
Yeah,
find out
exactly.
what happens. Yeah,
exactly.
Is the good thing going to happen or the bad thing going to happen? And all of that. Yeah. So bringing it back to books and Tod's books and all of that, is there anything you want to add about the world of the whole gangster world or the world you're stepping into next? I think you mentioned that you're moving into a new area, maybe?
Well, not immediately. So in my new book, The Low Desert, which comes out in February, there's stories that are in this gangster universe that you've read. And there's stories that take place in another universe, which is the Salton Sea in the 1960s. So I had written a character named Sheriff Drew. He's appeared in a couple of short stories of mine, The Salt and Blue Memories Start Calling. And also he actually makes an appearance in my book, Living Dead Girl. So I've been writing this character for a very, very long time, 20 some odd years. I've been writing this one character off and on. And I have this new story, the title story of The Low Desert, which is a very long short story about his time working at the Salton Sea. And my plan is to develop that into something else that you will see somewhere at some point in time. But the gangster books, I'm going to keep writing those at least for a little while. So I've got another novel to write. I'd mentioned before that Amazon had optioned the books for TV show. If the TV show actually ends up being on the air, I'll be writing those gangster books until you're dead. But I would probably do other stuff as well. But there's an end date on Rabbi David Cohen, Sal Cupertine's story. I know how it ends, and I know how to get there, and I'm not going to prolong it longer than it needs to. But because I think the books themselves, for adaptation, lend themselves. The first two books, you could probably get 4 seasons out of the first 2 books. And so you'd need the last book to know how it ends. And I could just tell you guys how it ends if you want. I could just...
No.
No? You could just reveal that for you.
The second book ends with like a cliffhanger, right?
Correct.
So it clearly leads into the third book. So
correct.
When's that coming?
Well, I have to write it. So the plan is for that book to come out in 2022.
2022.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm going to get to work on it right away. I've written a fair amount of it already, but what happened is I was working on the book. This TV situation happened. It seems like a very promising situation. I'd tell you more, but I can't. But it's a very promising situation. And so I didn't want to finish the third book before knowing sort of where we were going to be with the show. And so instead I did the book of stories, which was great. I absolutely loved it. I love writing short stories.
Yeah.
And in the process of writing these short stories, I came on this other idea that I think is promising as well. So everything I do is going to involve someone with a gun thinking about his life, staring out into the middle distance.
Gotcha. And making some jokes along the way.
You know, the low desert stuff doesn't seem very funny. There's not a lot of room for humor in those ones, but we'll see. We'll see. I mean, I'd like to be like James Lee Burke and be able to write super serious stuff and every now and then have the main character crack wise, but I don't know. It seems to me like I can write funny or I cannot write funny. And it's hard to marry the two if the story doesn't demand it. Yeah.
A great essay about the Salton Sea, right, that you had recently.
Oh, yeah, in Alta Magazine. If you guys want to look for that, if you go to altaonline.com, I wrote a brief piece about the Salton Sea in their last issue.
That was great. Well, I don't know how we want to do this, Shelley. If we open folks up to see if they have questions, you can always type something in the chat, and we can unmute you.
May I ask a question?
You may, Sue.
Thank you. I have not listened to your podcast on a regular basis, but I did dip into episode 162, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
And I am very curious about how you got this started, how you do it, how the three of you get together, what you decide to talk about. I want to know how this all works for you and how it adds to your literary life in a way.
Sure. So Literary Disco, of which Grace Fox, who's joining us, is apparently a big fan. Thank you for coming, Grace. She's upside down there. We've been doing Literary Disco now for, I want to say, 7 years. It's been a really long time that we've done it. We took a little bit of a break when Ryder and I both had huge projects that we just could not devote any time to the show for. But we've been doing it pretty consistently, twice a month or more since 2013 or 14, something like that. Like before podcasts were a thing, we were doing it. And so it's hosted by me and Ryder Strong and Julia Pistel. The three of us went to graduate school together. And in fact, before we went to graduate school together, I was Ryder's teacher at UCLA Extension. I taught him in a creative writing class, and we had become friends. And Ryder is an actor and a writer and a director. And Julia is a writer and owns an improv theater in Hartford, Connecticut, and is an essayist. And we had always had these sort of long, involved conversations in our life about the books that we like. And Ryder and I like to argue with each other, and Julia likes to tell both of us that we're morons, and then we move on. And so we'd been doing that in real life for a very long time. And narcissism and hubris suggested that we should then let the rest of the world in on that conversation.
That's good.
That's how you know that you think highly of yourself. I'm so witty and so interesting. People would like to listen to me talk about the thing I'm interested in.
To hear from you, right?
That's a great question. I can think of at least one person who's probably tired of hearing me talk in this house for the last 3 months.
Tod, can I say that you almost lost me podcast-wise when I found out how unkind you are to George Eliot in Middlemarch. So
I've had a change.
Okay.
I've had a change. So anyway, so the show's been on for a long time. We've done 170 some odd episodes. The show is inordinately popular. I don't have an understanding of how this became true, other than there's a lot of people who loved Ryder when he was a young person on television. But it is inordinately popular. And every year, someone will say it's, the best podcast about books on the internet. It makes us really happy. Like the Washington Post once said that about us. We're like, how does the Washington Post know that we exist?
I know.
So all those things are interesting. But the way we do it is pretty simple. We meet up on Zoom, just like this. We have a producer. We record our tracks. The producer mixes them, sends them out into the world, and then uploads them. And they're in your earbuds and all over the world. A few years ago, I guess it was 2 years ago at this point, the website LitHub essentially bought us and brought us over to LitHub, which was great because then we didn't have to do all the back-end stuff on our own. And so now we're part of the LitHub radio network, which is fantastic. And if you haven't visited LitHub, it's a great sort of all-purpose literary website, essays, stories, reviews, all kinds of stuff. And there's a bunch of other shows that are on there too, including Other People, which is run by my friend Brad Listy. But we love doing it. And during the course of the pandemic, we just sort of decided, hey, look, people need someone other than themselves in their ears periodically. And if the three of us can get together and tell some jokes and laugh about things and talk about our lives, that it might help people to hear us every week versus twice a month, that we're willing to do that. And it's been great. It's actually been sort of a lifesaver knowing that once a week I get to talk to my friends, Ryder and Julia, because all of you know, like at first when this all happened, it's like every day you're like, I need to Zoom with that person I went to high school with. And now you're like, I just want to be left alone. I can't talk to one more person.
Right.
But it's great to be able to catch up with my friends on a weekly basis and have those conversations. And, I love Ryder and Julia. We're close, dear friends. And invariably when fans meet one of us in person, they're like, are you guys really friends? Like, well, yeah. Of course.
Cool. Nice comment about literary disco in the chat, Todd. I don't know if you saw that. Nice comment in the chat.
No, what they say? They say I'm the best looking host?
Yeah, that too. But literary disco is so amazing. Thanks for doing it and keep it up.
We will. We're on the job.
Did you have something you wanted to ask Kate or?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I really like reading your essays that you write about your neighborhood. You had one a few years ago, I think, called The Living Desert, and then you just had that one published, like last week, a week before, about quarantine and life in your neighborhood now. I was just wondering, do your neighbors, I'm assuming people in your neighborhood, because you're on Nextdoor and stuff, right? They know who you are, right? Do they read your stuff?
There's a few neighbors who know who I am. Not a lot. So I'm not the most famous person who lives in my neighborhood. The most famous person who lives in my neighborhood is MC Ren from NWA. He lives down the street from me. And I don't think anyone but me knows that's him. But I do. I know. But there's a couple people. A local librarian lives here. So she knows Jade Valenzuela, who's lovely. She's a librarian at La Quinta Library. But no, I don't think so. I don't think they know. I do know that the essay that I wrote, The Living Desert, I do know that people were aware of that one. So that essay, and if you're interested, I'll post it up on the Stories Sacramento page. That essay was about a woman who lived in our gated community who was murdered by her boyfriend and then dumped on the golf course behind my house. And this happened, I want to say it was maybe 5 years ago at this point. It happened right around Christmas. And at the same time that this happened, the HOA that I lived in was having this really bizarre, contentious election where they were having robocalls and mass mailers, and people were knocking on doors and asking you if you believed in freedom. Like it was surreal. But then this woman was murdered and nobody said anything. And I found that extraordinarily offensive for a number of reasons. And so I wrote this piece, and the woman who was killed, she was a teacher at a local high school. She taught at Palm Desert High School, which is just a few miles away from here. And it had ended up that we had lived sort of parallel lives. We were the same age. We had worked within a mile of each other our entire lives. We lived in the same gated community. We had mutual friends, but we'd never met each other. And I had heard from her friends that they had seen the essay. And then somewhere like on the Homeowners Association website, someone had posted it up there saying, oh, I think this is about us, because I'd never said where it was that we lived. And then right after that, like this had been like 3 months after she had died, they finally put something up saying, oh, by the way, one of your neighbors was murdered. So it's a strange place that I live. I live in a resort town, and a lot of the people that live around me don't live here full time. They're snowbirds from other places. and their lives are the most important thing in their life is the length of the grass in the common areas, and they will murder a guy for the length of that grass. So I find a lot of rich territory in these lives. And the other essay that Kate mentioned, I wrote a piece for an arts grant that they're giving in the Coachella Valley for artists to talk about this peculiar time in our life. And I wrote about my next door neighbor who showed up in my house one morning. He has Alzheimer's, and he had wandered into our house. And so I wrote a piece about that. But, it's not like I'm ever really looking for things to write about. Sometimes something happens to me and I get obsessed by it, and I can't not write about it, or else it's the thing at 4:00 in the morning that keeps me up. And I need my sleep in order to keep this perfectly fit body you see here on Zoom.
Just wanted to say that your podcast where you reviewed the Overstory made me a fan of yours for life, because you absolutely agreed with me. And you were the only person I know who actually did. So thank you.
You're welcome.
But that's not my question. My question is, you were talking about the various kinds of things you write, essays which are both serious and not about a gangster or murdering, and then crime novels. And I'm wondering how you slide, if you slide easily between those two types of writing, and or not, and which you like doing better.
It's not easy to slide between them. I have to change the way I think. So if you read my essays, you'll see that the essays are written in a peculiar style. Oftentimes, I often use sort of a montage style for the essays that I write. The sort of the longer form essays. The Salt and Sea essay that I wrote is a pretty linear piece. But I use a peculiar style for my essays because I'm talking about myself. And so often when I'm talking about myself, I want to replicate on the page the way that I think. And the way that I think is not often in scenes. It's often in, bits and pieces of marginalia, essentially. Whereas when I'm writing fiction, I adhere pretty closely. When I was younger, I used to do sort of more experimental fiction, but then I realized I like money, and so I stopped doing that. I'm adhering pretty closely to a standard character setting, needs, wants, and inciting incident scene structure that you see, even if you're not aware of it. It's the scene structure of all sort of contemporary fiction, and most contemporary narrative nonfiction as well follows the same sort of path. So I have to remind myself in fiction, if I've been working on essays, like you got to be with a person, you got to be in a place, there has to be a linear timeline. Even in flashback, these things have to be working, and I don't necessarily worry about that in essay as much. So the essay that Kate brought up a moment ago, The Outside In, about living in the pandemic, it starts by saying there's a man standing in my living room. And so it starts in present tense, it then shifts to past tense, it comes back out into present tense. I admit that the man is still in my living room, but I say I haven't seen him yet. And so I'm messing with your perception of time and reality in the essay, because in fact the essay is about how time and reality have seemed to melt together during this time. And so part of the goal of the essay is to replicate the experience of this thing that I'm going through. And so I'm more likely to do something like that in nonfiction than I am to do it in fiction. And it's a trick. This is the part of writing where I know that I'm manipulating you, but I'm manipulating you for the thing that I need to do. So for instance, also I had an essay that was in Best American Essays a few years ago called When They Let Them Bleed, about seeing a boxer die in the boxing ring. And it's a story about seeing this boxer die, but it's also about sort of my fucked up childhood. And in the second paragraph of that essay, I say, I am aware that a person being killed in a boxing ring is more important and more powerful than my fucked up childhood. And so by saying that in that sentence, in that paragraph, all of a sudden I am erasing the line that you're having in your mind by saying, oh, well, he had a fucked up childhood, but he didn't get killed in a boxing ring. So by admitting that I know that, I'm now letting you off of that weight of having to think about it. So it's a trick, but it's a trick for you to get through that essay to hear the larger issue that I'm talking about. So a lot of what we're doing in both fiction and nonfiction is understanding what the reader needs at a given time, and the reader needs different things in nonfiction than they do in fiction.
Can you work on both at the same time? Can you work on more than one thing at once?
Yeah, but not on the same day.
Okay.
Yeah, so as long as there are days, so I write a lot of book criticism. I'm a book critic at USA Today, and I can write a book review for USA Today in the morning and go work on my book at night, because that's completely different animals. But the creative work, when I'm in it, I got to stay in it. I have to stay in that voice in my head. And this is sort of the battle of writing long novels about a hitman, is I'm keeping that voice in my head for a year, 18 months or whatever. And so then Wendy, my wife, and I go to Trader Joe's, and I'm like, this motherfucker grabs those chocolate covered almonds, he's gonna be taking a dirt nap. And my wife will have to be like, could I have my husband for just like 11 minutes? Please don't dirt nap the guy who's taking the yogurt covered pretzels.
It's not his fault.
Stop. You're making me hungry. Well, I thank you so much, Tod. This was fun. This was great. So good to see you again. And we hope to see you next year with your short story collection, right?
Happy to do it. It's always a good time. Thank you all for coming. It's nice to see so many pretty faces.